بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ألف لام ميم.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the Merciful, the Compassionate, I'd like to first greet you with the greeting of Islam, Assalamu alaikum, which is peace be upon you. And I would like to read a translation of this, or an interpretation of these verses that were recited from Dr. Cleary's The Essential Quran. It's called the chapter of night. In the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful, by the night when it is dark, and the day when it is light, and the creation of male and female, your endeavors are surely diverse. As for those who give and are conscientious, and believe in good and right, we will facilitate ease for them. As for those who are stingy and complacently satiated, and repudiate good and right, we will facilitate hardship for them. And their wealth does not profit them when they fall. For guidance is up to us, and the hereafter and this world are ours. So I warn you all of a fiercely blazing fire. None shall enter it but the most villainous, who repudiate the truth and turn away, and the most conscientious keep out of it. They who give up their wealth to become pure, without having any favor to be repaid to anyone, but only desiring the acceptance of their Lord the Most High, who will surely be pleased. There's a tradition of Sayyidina Ali, who is the cousin of the Prophet and the fourth Caliph of Islam, that says, we hate that which we don't know. There's another Arabic proverb that says, whoever is ignorant of a thing is its enemy. Both of these statements reveal something essential to the existence of conflict and hatred amongst people. Ignorance, if there is to be true peace, ignorance, if there is to be true peace amongst people of diverse thoughts, beliefs, cultures, ethnicities, there must be understanding. In order for true understanding to exist, there must be a serious examination of the beliefs that people hold, as this is the only way to understand what motivates them. When it comes to Asian peoples and the peoples of Africa and the Middle East, this has been perhaps never more important than the time we're in now. What these cultures share is the deep awareness of the presence of the sacred in the midst of the profane. Our Western culture is uniquely conspicuous precisely because the sacred has been banished from our midst. Today, many people believe religion and sacred thought should be relegated to the personal hobbies of eccentrics. But of recent times, its absence has been more intensely felt, and amongst us are those who are questioning the sustainability of a society that banishes from its borders the divine. Islam is a religion that celebrates the sacred, that declares it from exalted minarets for all to hear. It does not demand that you respond to the call, but it simply asks that you hear it. And it does not shy away from examination and discussion in the most civilized of manners. The Quran says, call to your Lord in the best way and discuss things in the most excellent of ways. In order for dialogue and mutual discourse to occur, there must be an understanding of the universe, which the topic of discourse in its broadest sense takes place. In other words, we must grasp universals before we can discuss specifics. With any intelligence and fairness, that discussion is impossible if we look at the specifics without dealing with these universals. It is unfortunate that we constantly hear people speaking about Islam and denigrating its teaching, not from a premise of knowledge, but rather ignorance in its most belligerent form. In the West, concerning Islam, this ignorance consistently reveals itself by focusing on specifics in a stereotypical fashion. The historical roots for this complicated, to say the least, animosity is impossible really to go into any length about in this short time. But there has been, historically, an engaging and compelling relationship with the West. Islam has had this historically. And oddly enough, some of Islam's, as well as the West's, most original thought came out of this creative tension that has persisted over the centuries. But the realm of ideas has long since left what Gibbon called the great debate. And what was once a creative tension has been reduced to a one-sided turkey shoot, to use the words of an American hero of the recent Gulf War. And unfortunately, that is indicative of our ignorance about geography, because it was Iraq and not Turkey that they were shooting at. But when you're looking from a jet airplane on a computer screen, it's very hard to distinguish between brown people, I suppose. But there is another West, I believe, that is less known. And it's the West that I want to say that I am from, because I am a Western person. And it's the West of people like Herman Samuel Reimarus, who lived in the late 17th and early 18th century, who wrote, "I am convinced that among those who accuse the Muslim religion of this or that fault, only very few have read the Quran, and that also amongst those who indeed have read it, only a precious few have had the intention to give the words the sound meaning of which they are capable." I find that extraordinary that it was said at the time that he was living, coming from the West. It is also the West of Henry David Thoreau, who said, "We condemn the Arabs, but we have much to learn from their way of life." It is the West of Thomas Carlyle, who said in England in the late 19th century, "Our current hypothesis about Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is that he was a scheming impostor, a falsehood incarnate, that his religion is a mere mass of quackery and fatuity, begins really to be now untenable to anyone." And this is the late 19th century, which is unfortunately has not been heeded until now for many people. It is also the West of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, who wrote, "How strange that in every special case one praised in one's own way. If Islam means surrender into God's will, it's in Islam we all live and die." And finally, it is the West of our speaker tonight, Thomas Cleary, who said in the introduction to his Essential Quran, "The Quran is undeniably unique in this tradition, in the sacred tradition of text, and indeed unique in the entire context of classical sacred tradition throughout the world, in having been revealed in the full light of history through the offices of a prophet who was well known. As the last link in a chain of revelation going back to time immemorial, even to the origin of humankind, the Quran has the special function of recollecting the essential message of all revealed books and distinguishing this from the opinions and reactions later interpolated into the ancient texts whose original dispensation had taken place in remote and even unknown times." And this is one of the finest summations that I've ever seen written in the English language of the Quran. Our speaker is not unknown to many of you. He has spent a remarkably fruitful and prolific life in opening doors of perception for people impeded by the confines of their language, translating a phenomenal number of classic texts from the original Chinese, Japanese, and Arabic languages. He is himself a sign of God. And I say that because in the Islamic tradition, the Muslims have always looked upon intellectual and spiritual gifts as a sign of God. In Arabic, it's called ayatollah. From his works, one discerns an intense desire to break down barriers and provide new ways of seeing other people, seeing them in their own light, not in projections of light coming from themselves. His recent, The Essential Quran, in my assessment, is an invaluable contribution to the profound need the West has in understanding the Muslims and the message of Islam. For it is just that, a messenger that seeks not to be killed, but simply to be heard, reflected upon, and practiced by those who recognize what it is and what it has to offer. He will tonight address the issue of women in Islam, not from its usual aspects, but from an examination of the universals that must be understood before we can look at any of its specifics. And I hope that all of you listen with an open heart and an open mind to this remarkable man. And at this point, I would like to ask Dr. Cleary to come out.
Now, for my sources tonight, I'm going to focus on three main bodies of material. First, of course, the Quran. Second, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. And third, sayings of the Imam Ali, the last of the righteous caliphs. As regards to what is happening here and now throughout the world in the Muslim community, I can't really comment on that because I don't have the information. And I suggest that nobody does, because a great deal of the relevant information is inherently inaccessible. It can't be found by researchers. It says in the Quran, at the end of time, one day you will see the believing men and the believing women their light streaming before them and at their right hands. Now, if you go to someplace with an attitude, a hostile attitude, obviously you're not going to be able to see that light. So I can't rely on reports of very limited information without considering the fact that true harmony within homes is something that can only be perceived by the eye of harmony and the feeling of harmony. Now, to turn to the matrix or the basis of what I have to say tonight, first I think it's important to remember always that Islam is a whole. And so to understand the significance of any given part or any given aspect of Islam, it's essential to understand that part or that aspect in the context of the whole. And that includes the idea of the overall purpose and meaning of life. So if we want to discuss the issue of the place of women and womanhood in Islam, we have to understand the Islamic idea of the purpose and meaning of life within which the purpose and function of the individual is enacted. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, let's visualize the mosque as the center of public life, and the home, in some sense an extension of the mosque, as the center of private life. Now, with that vision of life in mind, let's consult some verses from the Quran's chapter on light, where God is referred to as the light of the heavens and the earth. The book says, "The light is in houses which God has allowed to be raised, that the name of God be remembered there, where God is glorified in the mornings and the evenings, by people who are not diverted from remembrance of God by business or commerce. People who are not diverted by business or commerce from remembrance of God and persistence in prayer and giving of alms, as they fear a day on which hearts and eyes will be transformed, that God may reward them for the best of what they did." Then it concludes like this: "Do you not see that God is glorified by all beings in the heavens and the earth, even the birds on the wing? Each one knows its own mode of prayer and of praise, and God is aware of all that they do. For to God belongs the dominion of the heavens and the earth, and the journey is to God." Now that last line is the key. This is the meaning of life. The journey is to God. The contrast to this is also given in the Quran, where it says, "Vying for more and more diverts you until you go to the tombs." A reference to our end in the tombs has to do with our material strivings. So we have to realize, when we try to understand anything in the world of Islam, that the practice, the remembrance of God, changes the quality of cognition. There is a qualitative change in the mind, resulting, of course, in a change in the way you experience everything. And even if one doesn't participate in this remembrance, if one wants to take an intelligent standpoint toward Islam and the world of Islam, one has to take this factor into account, that the actual practice of remembrance of God, which in Islam is at least during the 5 daily prayers, but really is a matter of constant awareness. Now, because of this emphasis, for purposes of comparison, I won't compare Islamic ideas to contemporary Western secularism, because there really is no fair basis of comparison. What I'll do instead is make reference to other traditions which similarly emphasize the relationship, a harmonious relationship among the natural, social, and spiritual aspects of human life. Now, to understand the religious injunctions of Islam as well as any other system, we have to understand the basis or the reason for those injunctions. In modern times, where religion has been rejected by so many people, there is this assumption that religious injunctions are arbitrary dogma. But if we look at the expressed reasons, the expressed source and basis of injunctions in Islam, we can see much better the logical pattern of the purpose, what these are supposed to accomplish in our lives. I think one of the best statements for understanding the basis of injunctions in the Quran is this, in the chapter on Rome. There is no changing the nature created by God. That is the right religion, but most of humanity does not know. Now that nature, the nature created by God, that means the primal nature, the original nature, the way we really are and should be. And here where it says most of humanity does not know, well, most of humanity is conditioned by the environment. We're conditioned into acting in ways that is contrary to our real nature. And so that makes us ignorant of the religion that is actually built into us as our genuine God-created nature. The Quran also says, God wishes to lighten your burden, for the human was created frail. So here we see the purpose of injunctions being as a way of managing those aspects of ourselves that are vulnerable. So on the one hand, it's honoring, protecting, and enhancing the real nature, while at the same time protecting it against distortion, which in its vulnerability it can undergo in this earthly environment. Now, another difference between Islamic thought and contemporary secularism that needs to be briefly touched upon without going into a deep discussion of the Western ideas, political ideas of relevant issues. These are the questions of what it means to be dignified, what it means to be ennobled, what it means to be liberated. Now in Islam, all of these things, dignity, ennoblement, liberation, these are all God-centered or God-oriented rather than being self-centered or self-oriented. Here's an example from the sayings of Ali. Certainly the earth is not devoid of those who rise in honor of God for good reason, either openly and notably or in fear and obscurity. They consider easy what seems hard to those who lead a life of comfort, and they take to what the ignorant are averse to. They are physically in the world, yet their spirits are suspended in the highest liberation. So this is a universal kind of liberation, not just for one group or another. And it's a spiritual liberation that's not defined by human laws. So when we try to understand what Islamic teachings regarding the freeing of the soul are all about, we have to understand this aspect of liberation. Okay, let me get into the substance of the talk. I'll start with the beginning of the chapter on women, appropriately enough. As almost every chapter of the Quran begins, it starts with invoking the name of God as the epitome of compassion and mercy. Now, in contemporary America, it's almost taken for granted that monotheism is somehow masculine, but the aspects of compassion and mercy are not really particularly masculine images, are they? And yet this is what starts all but one chapter of the Quran. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhan nas. Ya ayyuhan nas. An-nas. Humanity. Oh humanity. It addresses us collectively. اتقوا ربكم والذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة. Revere your Lord who created you from one self or from one soul. Now I'd like to look a little more closely at the specific words of the text. اتقوا ربكم. This word, which I am glossing as revere, comes from a base root which originally means to protect. And in this form, we have it here, it means to protect yourself, to watch out. So that's why it's sometimes translated as to fear God. Now, if we look at the context in which this is spoken, watch out for God who created you, this refers to mindfulness of our origins. The word for creation here, khalaqa, has a derivative, a noun, khulq, which means nature or character. Now, the passage I cited earlier where it says that nature as God created is the right religion, the word there is fitra, which comes from fatara, to create. And fitra also, it means nature, like khulq means nature or character. So to be wary of God in respect of God being the creator means to preserve the true nature as God created it. Now another derivative from that word for creation is khuliq, which means fit or suitable or apt, adequate or worthy. There's a good word. So here we have the sense of revering God by preserving the nature, the worthiness of the nature that God has created. الَّذِي خَلَقَكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ, who created you from one self. Now there alone is less than enough, that we're created from one self, or one soul. But let's look a little more closely at this word, which I'm glossing, self or soul, in Arabic, nafs. Now in Arabic, for those who are not familiar with the language, words are built up out of basic roots, which are usually made of 3 consonants, and then elaborated so that from one root you can make up to 15 bases, and then those bases are elaborated into so many different verbal forms and all sorts of derivatives and whatnot, creating, in fact, with every root, an entire family, a universe almost of meanings. Well, let's look at the meanings that we can generate from the root of nafs, meaning soul or self. Basically, as a word, nafs means soul or life or an animate being, a person, essence, nature, identity, or self. Now, in the first base, we have two verbs, nafusa and nafisa. This is quite interesting, actually. Nafusa means to be precious, to be valuable, to be priceless. This is the creation of God. But nafisa means to be stingy, to be sparing. Now, the second base tends to represent an intensification of the verb of the first base, or sometimes it makes an intransitive verb transitive. Well, what do we find in the second base? Nasasa, to cheer up, to comfort. This is, I envision this as the many selves, multiple selves, realizing their oneness, that we're made from one self. Now, the third and the sixth bases. The third base tends to make verbs which, if the verb of the first base represents a quality or a state, then the verb in the third base represents exertion of that quality or bringing that state to bear on something. Okay? And the sixth base is like a reciprocal, a mutual type of action. Well, what do we find here? Nafasa and tanafasa. The third base, to compete, to strive, to desire. And the sixth base, to rival, to contend. So here we have a complete lesson, just in one word, one expression, that we're made from one nafs, from one self, one soul. And in that one self is priceless value, but also the capacity for selfishness. There is comfort and cheer in the mutual action of selves, but then there's also the possibility of contention and rivalry. So here is a beautiful illustration of the context of the two aspects of religious injunctions to enhance and preserve that which is precious and to mitigate that which comes from selfishness, like contention and rivalry. Now let me continue with the original text here. So, the text goes on to say, وَخَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا وَبَثَّ مِنْهُمَا رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً. And God created from it, from that one soul, its mate, and then propagated from the two of them many men and women. And there are a couple of points I find particularly interesting in this passage. First, of course, the idea of souls as mates. Souls as mates. The other is where it says, بَثَّ مِنْهُمَا رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً. God propagated from the two mates many men and women. In other words, propagation of the species is referred back to God. This is part of the whole Quranic atmosphere of mindfulness of God, but I find a little more significance in it, which to me is indicated by the word kathir, many men and women. There is a sense in the Quran of the earth already being populated. Now in more ancient messages, you find the command, be fruitful and multiply. You don't find that in the Quran. There's much more emphasis on dealing with the fact that all these people are here. I mean, of course, there is great respect for the procreative function, but one is reminded most of all of the ultimate origin of creation, and one is also reminded of the need to deal with creation tenderly and in a way that produces harmony. So we find a lot of emphasis in the Quran about on taking care of orphans and getting along with neighbors, and a lot of emphasis on the different nations of the world getting to know each other. And it is in this light that I think the spiritual element of womanhood is able to come to the fore more clearly than we may see in earlier dispensations, because, in other words, the biological function, the procreative function with which we associate sexuality and gender, is not really so strongly emphasized in the Quran. Rather, the inner aspect of the relation between the man and the woman is what we find particularly important. Now this text goes on to say, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامَ, and revere God by whom you ask of one another. تَسَاءَلُونَ, it's a contraction of تَتَسَاءَلُونَ, a sixth base verb which means mutuality. This is another key phrase, by whom you ask of one another. This is another key phrase within the context of which we have to understand Quranic injunctions regarding relationships. Namely that there is this mutuality of asking, and, or perhaps I should say but, it's all in the name of God. In other words, the human relationship is understood consciously in the home as having a higher purpose. It's not a matter of arriving at compromises between individual whims. Now the text, this section ends by saying, and revere the wombs. The word for wombs also means kinship, blood relationships, and obviously both meanings are appropriate. Something that's quite interesting in terms of the phrasing of the text is that whereas in glossing it I've repeated the verb, in the original text the verb is only said once. In other words, the verb for revering has two objects in the same breath, God and the wombs. Now this suggests to me something very special about what is being represented by this word aham, the wombs, relationships. And we can see it right in the root, rahama, which means compassion or mercy. We can see not only, of course, in the invocation of the merciful, the divine mercy, constantly, but in the throughout the injunctions dealing with relationships, not only between men and women, but generally among people. This quality of mercy and compassion is of utmost importance. And as we shall see, it is one aspect of womanhood, particularly in the capacity of motherhood, that is brought out very strongly in the Quran and the Islamic tradition as a sign of God, particularly, I would think, to remind us of this essential quality of mercy, which I would suggest is all the more essential in a world that is full, where you have many men and women, as the text says. So let me start by talking about mothers. As I said a moment ago, in the Quran, human fecundity may be honored, of course, but it's not extolled. It's rather the social and spiritual aspects of motherhood that are more important. The Prophet is reported to have said, paradise lies at the feet of mothers. I think this is a lot more than just a sentimental remark. First, I should say that Islam gives special honor to mothers, but also emphasizes the importance of fathers. Let me just quickly quote this verse which talks about the obligation of every individual to care for his or her parents. The Quran says, "Lower the wing of humility to them both, mercifully, and say, 'My Lord, have mercy on them, as they took care of me when I was small.'" And the Quran also says, here God speaks in the first person, "And we have made humankind responsible for their parents. Their mothers carry them, sapped and weakened, and their weaning takes 2 years. That you be thankful to me," to God that is, "and to your parents. The journey is to me." Now here again, the repetition of the ultimate purpose. The journey is to God. Be thankful to your parents. The journey is to me, is to God. Now here, of course, we have a recognition of the tremendous, tremendous labor, the work it is of motherhood, carrying the baby and nursing the baby. Right there, I mean, if that isn't a sign of mercy, I don't know what is. Now it says their weaning takes 2 years. That's the legal outside limit. That you be thankful to God. That's a rather interesting statement. That children are nursed for 2 years, so that they will be thankful to God, and to their parents, of course, but to God. Now, I think we all know that there's another kind of milk besides physical milk. There's the milk of human kindness. And I think we all know what happens to people, what becomes of people who didn't get enough of the milk of human kindness when they were small. They grow up hungry and angry and dangerous, not thankful, not grateful people, and not loving people. So here I find something extremely profound and meaningful for society as a whole, the idea of bringing up children who are grateful to God, that is, children who are capable of being loving people, loving and giving people. So here again, to me anyway, it seems that the emphasis is not really so much on the physiological nursing, although of course that's there, it's taken for granted, but on the inner component of the nursing, the inner milk that makes giving people. As an aside, there is a technical legality of a prohibition against marrying someone who was suckled by the same wet nurse. I think that might actually have something to do with the recognition of the reality of the inner milk, because it's not easy to explain just in terms of the outer milk. Now, to focus a little bit more on this, the image of the mother as a sign of rahmah, mercy, let me quote a saying of the Prophet on this subject. The Prophet said, "God rendered mercy into 100 parts, keeping 99 and sending one down to earth. By virtue of that one portion, creatures are merciful to one another, such that even the mare lifts her hooves away from her foal, fearing she may step on it." Well, right away we have an image of mothering to represent to us mercy on earth. And I see immediately three functions there. First of all, of course, the mercy in the mare does take care of the foal, actually takes care of the creature. Then the other beings, like the human beings, for example, in the surroundings, are affected by that relationship. We are reminded of mercy. Our hearts are somewhat melted, warmed by the mercy of the mare lifting her hooves from her foal. And that makes it easier for us to be merciful, to transmit mercy. So already the meaning is growing. And then, at the same time, the Quran is always saying that the signs of God are signs for those who reflect on them. So when we reflect on the mare lifting her hooves from the foal, we ask ourselves, well, who taught her to do that? So in that way, we're reminded of God. We're reminded of divine mercy in the same way. So, in a sense, motherhood, and I have to emphasize that this applies not only to those who are themselves mothers, but actually to all human beings. Motherhood is important not only in a linear way, but which, in terms of propagation of a of a line of human beings, but also in a radiant way, in that the specific mood, shall we say, of motherhood, the mood of rahmah, of mercy, is radiant, and it affects us. It changes our hearts and our eyes. So in that sense, the idea of the mother and the woman in general is not so much biologically defined, but spiritually defined as this, a repository, and a radiant repository of the quality of compassion and mercy, which are fundamental to the development of a healthy human being, and naturally, by extension, to a healthy society. Now, let me call upon some witnesses from the side, some other traditions, to underscore this spiritual or this inner aspect of motherhood. One thing that's rather interesting in Taoism, where a great deal of study of natural science is combined with study of social and spiritual sciences, many of the metaphors, the instructive metaphors for meditative processes, are in fact metaphors from the processes of gestation and nursing. For example, there's an exercise called inner listening, and the standard image is of a mother hen listening to her eggs. And the belief is that the focus of attention is actually able to convey energy. There's also the image of the male becoming pregnant, and sometimes you can see pictures of a man with a baby in his belly. And these are representations of the kind of moment-to-moment, very intimate, very intense inwardness and concentration that is naturally part of the process of carrying a baby and nursing a baby. And if we think in Islamic terms of real nature being itself, real religion, we have to then believe that this faculty of this incredible patience and punctilious awareness is a natural inherent gift of womanhood. And in terms of literal relations with women, therefore, in this tradition, the reverence for the woman is connected not only with the function of compassion, but also with it's connected to this power of concentration, which the men try to imitate. I think actually that's one reason why a lot of meditation texts are written for men. It's not simply because of bias in the societies of the time, but because the men actually needed more work on developing that type of consciousness. Now let me read a passage from a Buddhist scripture which illustrates this principle. This is a passage about a pilgrim whose name is Surana, which means good stuff, the stuff of goodness, who goes to visit the mother of Buddha, who is Maya, which means magic. And in this story, Maya, the mother of Buddha, represents is the prototype of motherhood, but also a prototype of womanhood. Then Surana, emptied of notions of the forms of all beings, penetrating the minds of other beings, saw Lady Maya in the minds of all beings, her virtue sustaining all beings. Now, to me, this is like the idea of the inward milk, the milk of human kindness, which actually makes us human, if we got it in time, that is. Her virtue sustaining all beings, her body an accumulation of the virtues of all knowledge. Here's the image of the mother as the first teacher. Now, in that inner milk is more than just mercy. She was engaged in non-discriminatory perfect giving, impartial toward all beings, having united all beings in the fellowship of universal compassion. She had set out to actualize the virtues of all enlightened ones. She had entered the ocean of all ways of tolerance. Her mind was expanded with the flood of energy of all knowledge. She was indefatigable in clarification of all spheres of truth. She was adept in meditation on the essence of all things. Her mind was accomplished in all branches of meditation. She was engaged in all branches of meditation without confusion, and had perceived the unique sphere of meditation of those who arrive at being as is. She was intent on various meditations to evaporate the ocean of afflictions of all beings. She knew how to analyze the teachings of all the enlightened, and she had the wisdom to consider all the designs of reality. Now, I like this image of mothering because you see, of course, there's lots of meditative aspects to it, but it's all supported by knowledge as well. The ingredients of the milk include knowledge and understanding, as well as this basic feeling of warmth and compassion and sympathy. Now let me turn to the subject of work. And first it should be noted that in the context of Islam, work means action according to faith, not just making a living. And the Quran says, in the words of God, "I do not suffer to be lost the work of any worker among you, male or female." Now there are many cases in the Quran where everything is obviously spoken universally, but then there are some times when it does stop and mention male and female to make sure that you get the picture that it's talking about both of us. Now here's another interesting section on work from the Quran. It says, "Don't wish for what God has given more to some than others. For men there is a portion of what they have earned, and for women there is a portion of what they have earned. And ask of God from the bounty of God, for God knows all things." Now it says, don't wish for what others have more than you. I think this means to appreciate your own and everybody's talents as individual and unique. There's a beautiful saying from Imam Ali: "The worth of each individual is what one does well. The worth of each individual is what one does well." Now, it goes on to say that there's a portion for men from what they've earned and a portion for women from what they've earned. And this is one of those areas. There's quite a few interesting areas in the Quran where it doesn't specify what that portion is. And I think this is one reason why the Quran is constantly telling us to think. And it makes us do so too. That's one of the beauties of it. Well, let's think about this. The portion for men and the portion for women. Well, within the context of Islam, a man is expected to support the woman. So when we think about portions of earnings, one thing we have to think about is the difference between obligated income and discretionary income. In other words, income that is already under obligation and income that you're free to do whatever you want with. If you look at it in that way, money is not the value, and the value of the work can't be determined in a simplistic money formula, because the value of money itself differs according to how obligated it is. But nevertheless, clearly, the right of gainful employment for men and women is recognized in the Quran. Now, this passage that says, "Ask of God from the bounty of God," is kind of interesting. How do we value work? What are the satisfactions in work? It's easy to assume that when it talks about the bounty of God, it's talking about material things. But actually, everything is the bounty of God, isn't it? So, to me, this suggests that we also should think about the immaterial satisfactions in work when we're thinking about the overall economic structure. To think about both the material and the immaterial satisfactions. Now, in this case, for example, if a man is obliged to support his family, then logically he has a somewhat less leeway to seek immaterial satisfactions, because first he's got to take care of the material income. So this is why I think the Quran says that there is a portion for each, without saying in this case what the portion is, because there are many factors to be considered. And indeed, the last line says, "God knows all things." Now, to me, in reference to your asking of God, it speaks of God as knowing all things. So to me, this suggests that in making these assessments, one should consider all things, consider the whole context when we think about what the blessings and satisfactions of work are. Then, of course, we have to think about the general value of work and how we think of its value. Again, to quote the Imam Ali, there is the worker of work in the world for the world, who is preoccupied by work and distracted from ultimate destiny. Then there is the worker of work in the world for what is after it. Now, the Imam goes on to say that the latter type, the worker of work in the world for what is after the world, actually gets the satisfactions of the world as well, and so becomes, as he says, master of the two houses. So by not being frantic about material things, but working as an expression of our God-given nature, gives us two satisfactions, gives us an inner satisfaction and an outward satisfaction. Then we also have the chapter on night, which was read earlier, which begins, by the night when it is dark, by the day when it is light, and the creation of male and female, your endeavors are surely diverse. As for those who give and are conscientious and believe in good and right, we will facilitate ease for them. As for those who are stingy and complacently satiated and repudiate good and right, we will facilitate hardship for them. So to me this means that the real distinction here is between these two. Those who give and those who are stingy is one way they're described here. The real critical distinction is not the type of work you do. It says surely your endeavors are diverse. The question of what makes them worthy or not is the thing to look at. Now it says in the text, guidance is up to us, and the hereafter and this world are ours. This refers to God. Again, this is the whole context of the work, that it's not, the world doesn't belong to us human beings. So their wealth does not profit them when they fall, as it says. So by this we have to understand that we have to consider that the effect on our character of the work that we're doing and the way that we're doing the work, whether we are male or female. Now this is going to go on for a while, so I'm going to have an intermission. The last thing I'll talk about right now is the subject of menstruation, which is one of the issues that women have to deal with. It is mentioned in the Quran in a rather simple way, actually. In reference to menstruation, the Quran simply says, huwa adha, which in English means it hurts. And the verb on the first base, where this word comes from, adha, is adhiya, which means to be hurt. It's an intransitive verb. So, in other words, the Quran makes reference to the discomfort of the woman. And if you look carefully at all of the injunctions regarding menstruation, which are very few and uncomplicated actually, all of them have to do with providing for alleviation, privacy, and the comfort of the woman. Now there's a further dimension, the inner dimension. Menstruation is a kind of cleansing process, sort of between the external and the internal, but it has both external and internal dimensions. And we can note that the verb which is used for external cleanliness in this regard is exactly the same as the verb that's used for internal cleanliness, purity, immaculate heart and soul. Now we can find a clue to this function, shall we say, or this approach to menstruation in a saying from Imam Ali, spoken to a friend who was ill. And the connection is the idea of menstruation as indisposition. May God make what you have suffered a means of diminishing your sins, for there is no reward in sickness, but it diminishes sins and removes them, as it were like falling leaves. There is only reward in the speech of the tongue, and the work of the hands and feet. And yet God, the glorified, admits to paradise anyone at will for truthfulness of intention and goodness of innermost consciousness. So here's a hint for a positive function in disposition, not only this particular one, but of any kind, the inward use of indisposition to purify the heart. Now I understand that in contemporary society and with the economic structure that we have, there may be some objections to this type of attitude, but if we think in contemplative terms, and if we think of life as a process of remembrance of God, then certainly it would behoove us to consider providing for the security of all of those operations that involve our purification of ourselves and our remembrance of God. Well, I'll close the discussion of menstruation there. I'm sorry if I've invaded any privacy, but this is an area where I feel, quite frankly, that in the modern world, insult is added to injury, and that if we were a more contemplative people, we could approach it in a way that would be more emotionally satisfying, I think, and also far more spiritually satisfying. And I think that the benefits of this regular renewal, shall we say, and clarification certainly would naturally be, again, radiant, effusive, and benefit the whole community. And with that, I will, why don't we take 10 minutes recess, and then when we return, I will talk about marriage, sexuality, and conviviality. Let me proceed to talk about marriage. I'll start out by saying a few things about polygamy, which is one subject I'm sure everyone realizes is made a topic of controversy when discussing Islam and women. I think the important thing to understand about Islam in general is that there are no rights without duties, and no duties without rights. As far as polygamy is concerned, it is subjected to very strict regulations, which I might say, as far as I know, in the world, among the many systems that practice polygamy, Islam is the only one I know of that regulates polygamy. So if one wanted to study this particular issue in some depth, what one would need to do would not be to compare Islamic polygamy with Christian monogamy, but to compare Islamic polygamy with, say, Confucian polygamy, which is very different. In any case, let me just run over the conditions for polygamy. First, it says, if you fear you cannot do justice to the orphans, then marry women who please you, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear you can't treat them fairly, then 1. So the first thing we notice is that polygamy is for a social purpose. If you fear you cannot do justice to the orphans, it has to do with pulling together rifts in the fabric of society. And historically, it may be noted that this passage about polygamy, permitting polygamy under these strict conditions, was revealed after a battle in which many of the Muslim men were killed, and therefore many women were left widowed and many children left orphaned. Now, when it says if you fear you can't do justice to them, then 1, some people today say that this is a de facto recommendation for monogamy, because you can't do justice to more than 1 woman. And in fact, they cite this subsequent passage of the Quran which says, you cannot treat women the same, even if you try. Now, I feel that if this were meant to be an abrogation of the earlier injunctions, it would be known that this was an abrogating verse. No, it's not. Some people say it's a contradiction. Some people say that it means, after all, that monogamy is favored. Well, let's look at it this way. I mean, part of it is a translation matter. How can you treat different people the same? Is that treating them equally? No, it's not. People are different. If you have 4 wives, they're all different. They have different personalities. So I think we could read this passage better if we double read it. If we didn't just satisfy ourselves with glossing the word once. We could actually read it to say, you can't treat women fairly by treating them all the same, even if you try. Then it goes on to say, don't bias all of your affections so as to leave her hanging, suspended. Now, some people interpret this to mean don't bias all your affections towards one wife so as to leave another wife or wives suspended. But the text uses the singular here, which means that it doesn't necessarily refer to a polygamous situation. If we consider carefully and take into account other things that the Quran says about how men are supposed to treat women, What this says is not to keep any woman hanging or pending upon your biased affections or your biased inclinations. Now the word suspended or hanging also means dependent or conditioned. Now elsewhere the Quran says specifically to men, if there's something about your wives you dislike, well, it may very well be that you dislike something, but God has put much good in it. It's true, yeah. Yes. Amen, sister, it's true. So the Quran makes us think about these things, and from this passage we can see that the man is enjoying to appreciate the woman in depth, not just through a biased affection, which would leave her suspended or leave her hanging. Even in a monogamous situation, since a biased affection could change, the woman could never be secure. Now, when the Quran goes to say on, if you can't do justice, then just marry one, it says that would be better for you so that you don't go wrong. Now, the word for going wrong, the same root, also means to have to feed a big family. Now, this reminds me of one of the common prayers of the Blessed Prophet. His wife said he used to pray every day for protection from debt. And his wife asked him why, and he says, well, when a man is in debt, he lies. So here again, I think is another reflection of the idea that the earth is full, and really the thing to do is not to be fruitful and multiply, but to deal with what we have here. And it says, not to go wrong, and there is this echo of not producing too big a family for you to handle fairly and honestly. Now, that seems perfectly sensible to me. Now, there's quite a bit, as I mentioned, about how a man should treat a woman. Here's an interesting passage which forbids a man from treating a woman badly in order to induce her to sue for divorce, under which conditions the man would be able to keep some of the dowry. It specifically forbids that. Now, the verb here is kind of an interesting one. The base form means to become muscular. And it's hard to get a good gloss until we go to another word which is used as an equivalent, dayyaka, which means to narrow down, to cramp, to confine, constrain, to make things hard. So we can translate this basic verb as to get tough, actually. So the Quran says that the man is not supposed to get tough with the woman, to try to drive her away, unless, it says, she's guilty of open, obvious outrageousness. And then it goes on to say, but live together bil ma'ruf, justly. Ma'ruf is an interesting word in Arabic, beautiful word. Technically, it means that which is known, but the meanings and usage are what's universally accepted, what's good, beneficial, fitting, fairness, equity, kindness, friendliness, courtesy. So this is the way in which men are enjoined to live with their spouses. Now, in Islam, the marriage vow as a legal instrument is not until death do you part, as they say in Christian countries. In the Quran, there is very clear provisions for conflict resolution. For example, if the woman fears animosity or distance, coldness from her husband, there's nothing wrong with seeking to come to a settlement. I find the phraseology, if the woman fears, to be very important. Two things. Number one, that the situation is one that is actually threatening to the stability of the home and not just normal human range of moodiness, okay, if the woman fears. And the second thing I get out of this is that it's not to be let go too long, as we see so often here in this country, where unfortunately we find many good women practicing the Christian teaching of turn the other cheek and wound up getting beaten badly, sometimes even to death. Here, the woman is told to seek some sort of arbitration and settlement if she fears animosity or coldness from her husband. And there's another passage which says, if you fear, addressing general you, division between the two of them, shikak, division, or split, then appoint arbiters from her family and his family. And it says, if you wish to reconcile, well, God will help you. Now the word for split here is the same word that's now used in atomic fission, where we split nucleus and this inconceivable, unmanageable power comes out of it and you wind up with poison. Well, I see this in the same way. The splitting of the nucleus of the family, which we see so much here in this country. Look at all the energy it releases. Destructive energy, uncontainable energy, unmanageable energy, and poisonous waste. So I think that in general, the whole issue of the stability of the family, it's not really an ideological or political issue. It has to do with our life and our survival as a species. So let me turn to the basis of harmony between men and women as taught in the Quran. This is what I would call the basic structure of what the Quran refers to as a noble pair. And this passage, I must ask those of you who don't like linguistics to bear with me, because of all passages of the Quran, this is one of those that most illustrates the literal, technical impossibility of translation, of actual translation. This particular passage is very easy to gloss over, but to translate is actually impossible, and it needs a great deal of attention to each and every word. It starts out by saying, men are caretakers of women by virtue of what God has given more of to one of them than another, and by means of their spending from their wealth. Let me stop there for a moment. And first, to settle any doubts, mention that it is also permissible for a woman to support a man financially. And there is a hadith, a tradition of the Prophet, saying, in answer to the question whether it would be permissible for a woman to support her husband and orphans in her charge as part of charity. And the Prophet said the answer is yes, and she will have two rewards. Reward for taking care of relatives and reward for charity. Now let me turn back again to the idea of the man being the caretaker. First I'd like to look at the word for caretaker. It's qawan. This is most closely related to the second base of the verb qama, which means to accomplish, keep up, take care of, preserve, to attend to watch over. And the second base means to set upright, to lift up, to create, to shape, to arrange well, to do properly, to assess, or to appraise. There's also a related word, qawan, uprightness, straightness, normalcy, strength, vigor, firmness, stamina, consistency, support, livelihood. These are all images of what the supporter is supposed to be. Qawim means true, sound, authentic, firm, solid. Qiyam means accomplishment, performance, undertaking, support, sustenance. So here we have a total image of a supporter, which is not simply material, but has to do with the providing of the whole of the framework of stability of the people, of the family. Now, it's the passage by virtue of, by means of what they give of their wealth. It's quite obvious that this is one way in which the men are caretakers of women, by supporting them from their wealth. Before that, though, it says, by virtue of what God has given more to one of them than the other. And when it says one of them, the them is plural. It doesn't say one of the two of them. And it doesn't actually say which is which, although everyone assumes that it's the man over the woman. Whereas if the text wanted to specify, it could very easily, by means of a number of devices. So actually, it looks like it could go both ways. The beauty of it is, though, that it actually works both ways. That if we think in terms of what the man has more than the woman, such as shoulder strength, such as not having to menstruate, for example, well, what should a man do with his extra shoulder strength? You wouldn't want a man to compete with women on that basis, would you? No, to support women, of course. And why? Because of what God has given women that's better than men, namely this quality of mercy and inner sensitivity. That also should be supported and guarded, too. So it's like, if you want to read it this way, and I'm sure there are those who wouldn't agree, but in both senses, both in terms of that which men have more of, and both in terms of what women have more of, that puts the man in a position of protecting the woman. Now, then it goes on to say, now this is the part that you really can't translate, but I'll give a gloss like most people do. And the good woman is obedient. I'll stop right there. It's a fascinating passage because, first of all, the word for good woman, there's no actual noun woman in there. It is a, I guess you call it an adjective. It's really a participle. The female version of goodness. See, the emphasis is on the root of sahil, which means good, right, sound, substantial, solid, virtuous, practical, worthy, suitable, valid. The verb salaha, of which this is an active participle, means to be godly, to be in working order, to be well, to thrive, to be practical, to be appropriate, to match, to fit, to suit, to be valid, to hold true. So, as-salihat, the good women, it doesn't really give this sense of what the text says. It says the true female counterpart. That is to say, the true female counterpart of the qawam, of that sustainer, the protector, as we just defined, is defined as being obedient. The word for that actually is qanitat. Qanitat is, it does mean obedient, but specifically obedient to God. The text doesn't say literally obedient to the husband. It's obedient to God. Of course, that's obviously more important because that's where the real harmony comes from, is the consciousness of the husband and the wife of their presence, of the presence of God. Now, qanit, this word they translate as obedient, is the active quality of kunut. And kunut is defined in this way by the Prophet, God bless his heart. I think this is so beautiful. The best prayer, he says, excels in kunut. So in other words, this kunut, this quality, which they translate as obedience or humility, is the quality of prayerfulness, the essence, the inner aspect of prayer. And there's another definition of this word as to be humble and obedient to God. And the word that's used for humble here also means to be moved, to be touched. So we have the image of sensitivity to God. This is a very beautiful image of the man as the protector of this inner core of sensitivity to God. Beautiful. Now the text goes on to say, and this is just a continuation, like a definition of this word qanitat. Hafizatun lil ghaib bima hafizallah. This passage can be read in different ways according to how it can be grammatically construed differently, but we can read it this way, taking the inner interpretation. Mindful of the unseen, or protecting the unseen, by virtue of the protection of God. This fits very well with the idea of the inner sensitivity to God. Now the unseen is normally, people usually interpret this to mean the private parts, the external unseen. But the word itself also is used specifically to refer to the divine secret, the supernal, that meaning of unseen. So if we read this in a spiritual sense, we have this image of the protector protecting this in inner sensitivity, which is guarding something ineffable by virtue of God's protection. In other words, there's this inner awareness of God's protection. Now in Taoism, this is specifically referred to by a very ancient expression, unconsciously and unknowingly following the laws of God. There's also a Buddhist term, the formless discipline of the ground of mind. And this is what this particularly reminds me of. The idea of preservation has to do with the preservation of the purity of heart. And of course that is really the foundation of all morality and discipline. And what this passage suggests to me is that the woman, and I would theorize through her preparation for the possibility of motherhood, is endowed with a special inner sensitivity that not only can be hooked up, shall we say, to the function of motherhood, but also linked directly to awareness of the divine, of the supernatural. Now I'll say something about the subject of the connubial relationship. This is a little bit hard for people in the West to understand because the association in Christianity between sexuality and original sin, and because there is no apostolic tradition in Christianity for marriage and this type of connubial relations. This, of course, because after Christianity broke off from the matrix of Judaism, it left behind quite a lot of these things which were in Judaism. Anyway, the thing is in Islam, which seems contradictory to Westerners, is this appreciation of connubial bliss, while at the same time strictly regulating it. Well, the thing is that in secular Western thinking, the connubial relationship is a matter of pleasure. And nowadays, in fact, it's come to be regarded in terms of selfish pleasure, which is really the source of all of the problems that exist here. Whereas in Islam, the pleasure of the connubial relationship is a kind of inspiration to be grateful to God. And so it's treated with actually great reverence. It's as a natural thing, not separated, not made into a thing itself by which it becomes profane, but as part of a relationship which is ordained by the divine and itself sacred. Now, on this subject, the Prophet says, the conditions you keep most deserving of complete fulfillment are those by virtue of which you deem private parts permissible to you. That is to say that the conditions, the regulations, which are most worthy, most worth complete fulfillment, are the ones that make the sexual relation
banished from our midst.
Now, how do you want your children to grow up? Just think of the attitudes. I think particularly this is something that the young men of today in this country are perhaps in most need of, this kind of attitude. Now, regarding the issue of the woman's part in the connubial relationship, here again, I think one of the difficulties of understanding is that in the contemporary Western secular thinking, the idea of the woman's enjoyment is actually new, quite new. And this is very different from classical traditions. So there seems to be this idea that no one ever thought of it before. Actually, there is a tradition from the Prophet where he is speaking of the connubial relation, and he uses the verb play in this context in the sixth base, which refers to mutuality, a mutuality of play. Furthermore, he repeats the verb twice with a different subject. He says, you play with her, and she plays with you. So you have this image of mutuality, but there's also both are subjects.
Has been reduced to a...
Now, one thing that the Quran said it does like is unequal is where it says to the men to go to your wives whenever you wish, or as you wish. Another passage says as you wish, according to the command of God. But it doesn't say that to the women. That being unequal according to the political standards of today. I think those people who have actually marital experience understand why this is. If we were trying to explain it outside of the context of politics, we understand, number one, that if this function were controlled solely by the estrous cycle, as we see in the animal world, we'd have a couple of desirable results. One, there would be an excessive fertility rate, and two, there would be a roving promiscuity among the males. Now, another factor to consider is the difference in the internal cycle of the male and the female. The internal cycle of the male, which does exist, is shorter to begin with, even if it's complete, than that of the female, and it's also far more fragile than that of the female. It can be interrupted much more easily, far more easily. That is why, for example, in Taoism, there are a great many exercises devoted to offsetting this fragility of the male cycle. Then there's the fact that if the male is the provider of the family, the male is likely to be out of the house more than the female. So That's one reason why the matter is addressed in this way. In the domain of the difference between male and female, there's also there's a very significant factor here. I think all adults understand intuitively, but nowadays the scientists have actually come up with a chemical tracer of this function, and that has to do with with chemicals known as pheromones, which arouse the opposite sex. Now there is a difference between the transmission of male pheromones and female pheromones. Male pheromones are transmitted only by direct contact, but female pheromones are radiant. They fuse. So there you have it. Well, there again, that's the subtlety of the woman. That's why the Quran doesn't have to tell the woman about this. It's written in body. I would say, by the way, now this contemporary research on pheromones was done in the usual scientific way, where they actually manipulated people by use of chemicals. Now, of course, this is done under controlled conditions, but just think, if you're susceptible to being manipulated by invisible chemicals, wouldn't you want to have some way of guarding against it? This might, in short, give us some clue about another function of certain habits of dress encouraged by Islam, namely that there is a function of, shall we say, subliminal modesty, not just the modesty of the eye, at least in terms of the transmission of these chemicals. So, we shouldn't judge these things purely in terms of fashion. Now, another fascinating thing about Quranic teachings on the connubial relation, which to me make me think that they are very relevant today, and particularly I wish the young men of today would consider them, regardless of their ideological background. Now, in addition to telling men to go to your wives when you want, and by the way, I suggest, finally, in that discussion, that this is not really a man-woman issue, it's a man-machine issue. That's why I see it anyway. If we think today, the kind of life we live today, how often and how much is our marital relations affected and interrupted by the time clock, by what's going on outside, by the machinery for which we work outside. So to me, this statement, go to your wives when you want, is an affirmation of the centrality of life itself in the Islamic view of life, that the home is the center, and that you work for preservation of the home, which is actually your connection to the divine, rather than the image of the bedroom community where home is where you rest up, so go out the next day back to that race. This is what I see in this. I think it's very humane, and certainly not a political issue, though I see very well it could cause misunderstandings if just read out of context and not considered very deeply. Now, some of those conditions are as follows. Men are supposed to do something, it says, for the good of your souls. This means doing good deeds. Now, this is kind of interesting, that it's understood that this relationship is very pleasurable, but it's wrong to experience pleasures of this world as a consumer, without contributing anything. It's part of the idea that there are no rights without duties. So, in order to enjoy his relation with his wife, the man is told to do something good for his souls, do good deeds, and be wary of God. That's always there. Now, that obviously affects your relationship. And know that you will meet God. And the consciousness of God is so strong, even in this context. And cheer the believers. Cheer the believers. Gladden the believers. You are supposed to share the joyfulness. That doesn't mean, of course, in a vulgar way that as people speak, but it means to radiate the joyfulness, the harmony, which again strengthens the idea that the value of the relationship between the man and woman in this Islam perspective doesn't stop just at that individual couple, but has to do with the good of the whole society. Now, if you think in terms of what we call the atmosphere in a room, I mean, you can walk into a room and it seems tense, or you can walk into a room and it seems light or jovial or cold or whatever. We all understand that moods create atmospheres. Well, if we think in terms of the totality of all the people on this crowd earth, we certainly have to consider the value, the events, the pressure, the effect of people's moods. So I see the reverence for the home and good relations between husband and wife in every respect as valuing this as an instrument of producing and nurturing and radiating good mood. And I point out, by the way, this is the reason I say that a lot of the data about what's really happening in the Muslim world is not available to researchers, because it says to gladden the believers. Yeah, right. In other words, people who don't basically are hostile, who don't believe in it, and who are banging down your door trying to find out about your private business, the Quran does not instruct you to answer their questions. Because you wouldn't appreciate it. It's not trying to keep anything back, but it's understanding that there is such a thing as receptivity and the lack thereof. And as Ali said, hearts go blind when they're coerced. Now, let me turn to, I'm getting to the end, so don't worry. I want to just briefly touch on the subject of polyandry. Because polyandry is mentioned quite a bit, I find, in books allegedly about Islam and marriage and gender and things like that. There seems to be a tendency, we try to, number one, portray polyandry as actually the same thing. It's similar to polygamy, as though they were the same thing, just mirror images of one another. And there's a tendency to glamorize polyandry quite out of context, without examining the types of family relations and types of children were produced by polyandric situations. What we find instead is this image that polyandry is a sexual field day for the woman, just as polygamy is imagined to be a sexual field day for the man. Now let me give an illustration, an actual quotation from a book on the subject by a sociologist. This is a woman, and she says, "The compelling duty to provide sexual satisfaction is intelligible only if one is reminded of the fear of unrestrained female sexuality. Curbing active female sexuality, preventing female sexual self-determination, is the basis of many of Islam's family institutions." Unquote. I won't give the author, I don't want to disgrace this person. It's fairly typical type of thing, it seems. First of all, I have to say, the compelling duty to provide sexual satisfaction is a rather cynical expression. And I don't think that it's really in harmony with the attitude of reverence that the Quran and Islamic tradition really gives this subject, to suggest, to refer to this in such terms as compelling duty. Now, she says, curbing active female sexuality, preventing female sexual self-determination is the basis of many of Islam's family institutions. We'll ask ourselves, if we took away regulations on marriage, would that result in the reality, the capacity of sexual self-determination for men or for women or for anyone? Are there no other conditions, such as the behavior of everyone else? In other words, the idea that if a woman were not subjected to the regulation of Islam, that she would then be able to, then she have self-determination sexually, is patently absurd, because under any circumstances, or those circumstances particularly, her behavior is going to be influenced by the behavior of all the other women, as well as all the other men. So there would be no such thing as self-determination for anyone. Now, the idea that that sexual satisfaction as a religious obligation is intelligible only in terms of fear, again, I think is a cynical and actually an unnatural view. I will come to the Islamic view of this in a minute, but from the Taoist point of view, which similarly reveres this relation, we can say right away that there most definitely is another reason for sexual satisfaction. And in Taoist terms, the highest sexual satisfaction is expressed in terms which literally mean attainment of spiritual radiance, attainment of divine light. Matthew pointed out that is also considered the highest peak of all the religious arts. So in that particular context, the connubial relationship is also considered a religious art. And it is not for the purpose of pleasure, but a pleasure is a means of mutual attainment of a higher state, specifically through forgetfulness of the self. Now, as I mentioned, these attempts to glorify polygamy are done without real data. So in order to make my point here, and show I'm not being prejudiced as male, I've picked out some writings from a society in which polygamy and polyandry were both practiced, and in which the mores, the sexual mores, were in fact more liberal than they are among secular people in America today. I refer to Tang Dynasty China, which was from about 600 to about 900 AD. That was a special time, and though these mores did change, got much more conservative. During this time, polyandry was accepted, and we have cases, we have actual records of writings of famous women who were polyandrous, in which we can see something about what really happened to them emotionally in these relationships. Now I'm going to read a couple of poems from one of the most famous of all Chinese poetesses, a woman who is said to have been extremely beautiful and very accomplished musician and writer. She was polyandrous. She had several husbands, but other things going on at the same time. And here's what she had to say. This one is titled Thoughts on a Winter Night. With painful thoughts, I reach for verse to read aloud by the lamp. I do not sleep the long night, fearful of frigid bedding. A sad wind rises in the leaves, filling the yard outside. Regretfully, the moon has set beyond the window screen. My hope for freedom has, after all, never been quite fulfilled. Through ups and downs, I see in vain my true original will. To live in hiding, do not choose a place in easy reach. Evening sparrows twittering uselessly circle the woods. Evening sparrows twittering. Now that refers to all of the men, all the twits, flocked around her, because the assumption was in that society that women in this position could have any man they wanted. So the men, of course, attracted to her, assuming that she being free and having self-determination, they drove this woman crazy, as a matter of fact. So you see, I mean, there are other factors besides just rules on paper. One, of course, being simply financial factors. If one woman has to work 8 hours a day and another woman is at leisure, do they have the same self-determination or anything? Of course they don't. Now, this particular woman, she didn't have to do her own housework. She had a maid. She had several men to look after her. And yet, because of the society had both polyandry and polygamy, men and women their domestic situations were not solidified. And there was all of this open space where an awful lot of crowding took place. And in other poems, she speaks sadly and scornfully of the moths from the fields circling the guttering lamp, and images like that tear your heart out. Don't do any sort of glamorous image of freedom and self-determination. Now, here's the poem to her righteous man that she was separated from. This is called To My Love Across the River. Wistfully I gaze o'er the river, north and south. Empty songs of longing echo memories. Mandarin ducks laze cozy by the sandy beach. Water birds wing lazily through an orange grove. In the mist, the voice of song is hidden subtly. At the ford, the light of the moon sinks deep into the waves. I'm full of emotions, so near to you, and yet so far away. Hard to bear, ever I hear distant sounds of families on their laundry day. They have it. Here's someone who had all of the social freedoms that are considered so desirable by many people, and yet here she says, harder to bear whenever I hear distant sounds of families on their laundry day. Some people might think, oh, this is Confucian family sentiment, but no. Confucian family sentiment isn't like this. Confucianism is more like an extension of government. The emotional part is not really considered. And yet here, this woman who had all the lovers she could handle, had her chores taken care of, feels even worse when she hears sounds of families on their laundry day. Well, if we read the Quran, we find this makes perfect sense, because it says, and among the signs of God is having created for you mates from yourselves, that you may feel at home with them. That's what it says the purpose is. Here again, it doesn't say God created mates so you could populate the earth. It says God created mates from your own selves, from your souls, that you could feel at home with them. لِتَسْكُنُوا إِلَيْهَا. That word of which I translate here, feeling at home, has lots of meanings. Sakana. To be still, to be tranquil, peaceful, calm, at rest. It also means the abating, the subsiding, disappearance of anger and pain. It means to be assured, to lie, to trust, to have faith, to live, to dwell. So this is what we're doing together. This is what we're supposed to be doing together. It's this conviviality has some special meaning. And it goes on to say, and God placed between you love and compassion. Indeed, love and compassion. Mawadda wa rahmah. It doesn't say hawa, which means passion. It does mention the so-called physical or emotional passion. And why is that? Because this hawa is associated with bias and personal selfness. What it says that God placed between us, men and women, is mawadda wa rahmah, affection. Mawadda is affection, love, friendship. It can cover a range from the platonic to the relation between husband and wife, and rahmah is mercy and pity and compassion. Now, I would suggest that this mawadda and rahmah, the love, the affection and mercy, and the feeling at home. Now, one beautiful words that comes from this feeling at home, sakana, taskunu, is sakina. Sakina means home. Sakina means peace, especially divine immanence, peace of the divine immanence. And this is what I see in the Quranic prescription for our relationship, is that this is a way for us to draw down the sakina, to experience, participate in the sakina, the divine peace. And that in turn becomes a basis for even further enhancement and development of our nature. Now let me again draw a witness from the side. I'm going to return to the Lady Maya, the Buddhist Lady Maya, the mother of Buddha, who here represents in this passage the archetype of a woman. And this passage depicts what Taoists call spiritual intercourse, which is not physical, it's a spiritual intercourse. And this is what I see in the Quran's description of our relationship as being based on mawadda wa rahmah, on affection and sympathy. Spiritual intercourse. Now, ordinarily, spiritual intercourse thought of in terms of purity and spirit, but in Taoism it's believed that the spirit can convey vitality, which is a type of energy. And furthermore, that the energy and the vitality is not just energy per se, but that it has some kind of informational content in it. And the classic Tao Te Ching, it says like this, that vitality is very real, has truth therein. And the word means information, true information. Now, this hints at a function of the sakina, the peace of the home, as not ending in itself, but to draw therefore in with meditation. The reason that people seek silence and quiet and peace in meditation is to admit inspiration. And there I think we find the spiritual value of the relation of the man and the woman is an instrument of admitting inspiration. And to testify to this from a totally different tradition, I will read from Buddhist scripture, which says that the pilgrim saw Lady Maya in as many ways as atoms in the continent. This is a universalization. Many, many different ways of seeing these qualities of mercy and affection. Seeing her, he magically made his body as extensive as Lady Maya in universalization. And with this omnipresent body, bowed to ubiquitous Maya. In other words, you're reflecting these qualities of Rahmah everywhere they are. And as he was bowing, here's a critical thing, an infinite variety of concentrations entered into him. He observed those concentrations, making them externally undetectable, cultivating them, mastering them, remembering them, making them all pervasive, expanding them, watching them, increasing them, accomplishing them, and fixing their impression. So here we have the love and affection, feeling at home as a means of attaining peace, and the harmonious relation within a peaceful environment as a means of establishing a subtle communication, as is illustrated here, which is between the man and the woman, but at the same time and always in the consciousness of God. So I think if we want to understand why in Islam the woman is sacred to a man, we have to understand most of all this relationship in which we experience mawadda love and affection, and rahmah, mercy and compassion and sympathy, and sakina, peace. And we understand why this is so important for a man, because it is in the process of protecting this inner matrix of enlightenment that we develop our best qualities, our qualities of chivalry, our outward qualities of chivalry, such as valor and patience in adversity. And through our relation with women, we develop the inner qualities of chivalry, which are, in fact, none other than mercy and kindness and a longing for peace.